Hi everyone, I'm Silas, and welcome to Psilocybology. Since this is the first episode, I want to give it a special introduction. I'm here because I'm incredibly fascinated with the scientific study of psilocybin, and in the process of learning more myself, I want to share what I learn with all of you. Full disclosure, I come here with a bias that I want to be honest about. I hope that by educating people about psilocybin, more people will be in favor of researching this wondrous medicine. That said, I want to create the least biased podcast possible. And I won't just be cherry-picking the research that I talk about. If you ever feel like I left something out or didn't cover something in the best way possible, please let me know. You can send me an email at psilocybologist@gmail.com, and I promise to get back to you. So, what is it that I'm actually going to be talking about? I'm going to be breaking down and discussing research articles on psilocybin in chronological order from past to present. It'll be a deep dive, but one that I believe will build a strong foundational understanding of what we think we know about psilocybin. Down the line, once we have this foundation, this podcast might branch out, and please let me know if you have any ideas for where you want to see this podcast go. But for now, let's start here. One thing to note, in addition to learning about psilocybin, I also really hope people come away having flexed their critical thinking skills, and with a greater appreciation for research. My background and current day job is very research-oriented, so I find talking about research incredibly interesting and informative. Now, in addition to the podcast, there will also be a transcript available on the website for anyone interested. Occasionally, there might be a graph or two that won't be necessary to have by any means, but might be helpful for any of you who are a bit more of a visual learner. I should also say quickly, the articles I'm presenting on are ones that I found from searching psilocybin in PubMed, which, if you're not familiar with, is a great search engine for finding peer-reviewed research articles. Although I can't provide the full article for copyright reasons, unless it's open access, I will always provide the link to the article entry in PubMed, where you can oftentimes find the abstract, although that won't be the case for some of these older articles. From there, if you have access through school or work, you should be able to get to the full article. Now, unfortunately, I'm also only fluent in English, so I can't present on any non-English articles, but maybe one day, if any non-English speakers want to do a collaboration, we can make that happen. Now that that's all said and done, again, welcome to Psilocybology. Let's expand our mind. Real briefly, since I realize I actually haven't said this yet, psilocybin is the ingredient in magic mushrooms. This episode is on the article titled Comparison of the Reactions Induced by Psilocybin and LSD-25 in Man, authored by Harris Isbell on behalf of the National Institute of Mental Health and published in 1959. Now, LSD-25 in this case is just a different name for LSD. For some historical context, this is before the Controlled Substance Act, which became effective 11 years later in 1971. Although this was after the Harrison Narcotic Act of 1914 that banned opiate-containing substances, and after the prohibition and re-legalization of alcohol, psilocybin wasn't the focus of the prohibition effort until the late 60s. This is in part because psilocybin wasn't even isolated from mushrooms by Albert Hofmann until the mid-1950s. Albert Hofmann, for those who aren't familiar, is the scientist who also first synthesized and was the first to trip on LSD. He was a pharmacologist that worked for Sandoz Pharmaceuticals before they merged in 1996 to form Novartis. Although a bit tangential, I thought it was interesting to find out that Sandoz marketed LSD as a psychiatric medication called Delicid from the late 40s to the mid-60s. Sandoz is also the company that provided the psilocybin used in most of the early research we'll be discussing. I think it's also important to briefly discuss the author of this paper, Harris Isbell. He was the director of the National Institute of Mental Health, particularly the Addiction Research Center, from 1945 to 1963. To say Isbell is controversial would be an understatement, and I would argue first and foremost for the coercion of his research subjects. Although he often refers to them as patients or volunteers, the people involved in his experiments were black males who had been sentenced for drug offenses, particularly for narcotics or painkillers, many of whom had been suffering from a substance use disorder. To call them volunteers completely ignores the coercion used to essentially force their participation. Now, I'm not going to go into all of the details here regarding the very dark history of medical experimentation on Black Americans, But it's an incredibly important history to be aware of, and if you would like to know more, I would highly recommend reading Medical Apartheid by Harriet Washington. We will of course continue to bring this up as we discuss the literature, since it's really important to, 1, be reminded of it, and 2, be aware of what limitations this places on the generalizability of this early research. As will come up, set and setting, or the mindset and physical and social environment that one is in, drastically alters the experiences reported from really many drugs, but psychedelics in particular. The black men who were forced to participate in these experiments were clearly in a damaging environment that, without a doubt, was deleterious to their mental state. The second thing I would say that Isbell is most controversially known for is that his work was partially funded by the CIA as part of the MKUltra project, which encompassed a series of experiments, oftentimes illegal, to investigate drugs that could be used for interrogation and mind control. MKUltra started in 1952 and wasn't officially halted until 1973. So now that we have a bit of context, let's get into the article itself. Isbell starts by noting that in some early accounts by Albert Hofmann, psilocybin seemed to produce mental states that were similarly seen after the administration of LSD. He also mentioned that psilocybin was chemically similar to serotonin, which is a very important neurotransmitter found in the brain, and also similar to bufotenine, which is the hallucinogenic serotonin analog found in frog or toad skin. If any of you remember this, bufotenine is one of the drugs that Peter from Family Guy was unknowingly singing about in the song Gotta Give Up the Toad. Now, although a lot of research aims to test a specific set of hypotheses, this study was entirely exploratory. Isbell ends the brief introduction by saying, quote, "Because of the chemical relationship of psilocybin to serotonin and bufotenine, and because of the possible role of serotonin in the function of the central nervous system, a detailed comparison of the effects of psilocybin with those of LSD in man was thought to be of interest." Getting into the methods, this article actually presents 2 experiments, although mentions the first one only briefly as a preliminary experiment aimed at determining what dose of psilocybin would elicit a response. There were 7 so-called volunteers that took between 0.5 to 8 milligrams of psilocybin per 70 kilograms of body weight. This measurement, milligram, or as we will see with LSD, microgram, per kilogram of body weight, is pretty standard and will come up a lot in this line of research. 70 kilograms is used because it's thought to be about average. It's equivalent to 154 pounds. So for example, a dose of 8 milligrams per 70 kilograms means that someone who weighed 154 pounds would be given 8 milligrams, while someone who weighed about 193 pounds, or 87.5 kilograms, would be given 10 milligrams. To provide some additional context, the average dose used in a lot of the more modern-day research ranges from 10 to 30 milligrams per 70 kilogram body weight. So the ranges considered in this paper are relatively low. From this preliminary experiment, Isbell found that the mental effects were elicited from doses that ranged from 2 to 8 milligrams per 70 kilogram. With a better understanding of what dosages would elicit a response, the main experiment compared placebo, which is some inactive substance given as a control, to two different doses of LSD and 3 different doses of psilocybin. For LSD, the doses were either 70 or 150 micrograms per 70 kilograms. And for psilocybin, the doses were either 4, 6, or 8 milligrams per 70 kilograms. Isbell used a within-subjects design, meaning that all of the participants were given each of the options across different days. So for example, participant A might receive 4 milligrams of psilocybin on day 1, and then receive a placebo on day 2, and then 70 micrograms of LSD on day 3. Although it isn't specified how far apart these repeated experiments were separated, it is noted that Isbell used a randomized balanced order, meaning that the order of drugs someone received was randomized. This is done to counteract any order effects. So for example, we know now that you can develop cross-tolerance between LSD and psilocybin, such that if you take LSD on Friday and psilocybin on Saturday, the psilocybin will have much less of an effect than if you hadn't just taken LSD the day before. So if all the participants took LSD first, and then psilocybin second, they might end up concluding that the effects of psilocybin were less pronounced than they actually were. With the order being randomized, participant A would receive psilocybin on day 1 and LSD on day 2, whereas participant B would receive LSD on day 1 and psilocybin on day 2. This was also a single-blind study, meaning that the individuals given the drug, or placebo, did not know what they were given. The experimenter, or rather one of the ward attendants in this case, did know which drug was given to which individual. If neither the individuals who received the drugs or the individuals who administered the drugs knew what drugs were given, then it would be a double-blind study. In order to make sure people didn't know which drug they got, they mixed the drugs into a solution of raspberry syrup. 9 individuals were used for this study, and unlike the so-called volunteers mentioned for the preliminary experiment, Isbell does acknowledge that these participants were black males who had been convicted for narcotic law violations, although he doesn't go into much further detail as to how they were recruited into this study. It has been mentioned elsewhere that in some cases, the people he recruited were given some of the narcotic drugs that they had previously been arrested for using, as a coercive form of compensation. One thing he did mention is that all 9 of the individuals had previously experienced the effects of LSD. Although the setting isn't described in much detail, since we brought up earlier how set and setting are incredibly important, I wanted to note that he does mention that the experiments were carried out in a, quote, special ward devoted to clinical research, which had a common day room as well as private rooms that people could move between. It is left rather ambiguous, but I don't believe it would be making too much of an assumption to say that the conditions were likely far less than ideal. The last thing to talk about before getting into the results are the measures that were taken. The measures in this case can be split into objective and subjective measures that were taken hourly between 7 and 4 and 7:30 and 3:30 respectively. The objective measures were rectal temperature, heart rate, respiration rate, systolic and diastolic blood pressure, pupil diameter, and the threshold for eliciting the knee-jerk reflex. The knee-jerk reflex is when the doctor uses a little hammer to tap your knee in order to get your leg to kick. Interestingly, serotonergic agents, or drugs that increase levels of serotonin, enhance this automatic reflex and lower how much force is required to get your leg to kick out when you tap on your knee. As for subjective measures, the participants completed a 57-item questionnaire and underwent a mental status exam based on their reported symptoms. The questionnaire, as mentioned in the article, has a pretty big limitation in that the questions are incredibly leading and also focus on negative rather than positive experiences. Rather than asking participants to describe their experience, the questions are you nervous? Are you confused? Is someone controlling your mind? Etc. I'll be honest, if someone kept asking me every hour whether or not someone was controlling my mind, I'd start to question whether or not that was the goal of the person asking the question. Unsurprisingly, people generally responded yes to more and more of the questions as the dose of the drug increased. When we discuss the results, I kind of want to focus more on the objective measures. Now that said, Isbell actually starts off the results section by going into a qualitative description of the experiences reported after the administration of the 8 mg per 70 kg dose of psilocybin. He notes that participants reported the first subjective effects after 10 to 15 minutes, and these reports were of vague sensations that things looked weird or seemed peculiar. At this early stage, there appeared to be mild anxiety, which generally intensified by 30 minutes, resulting in some of the individuals expressing that they were afraid something evil was happening or that they might die. I want to pause here and mention again that this, in my opinion, highlights the importance of set and setting, as well as the importance that people are aware of what drugs they're taking and what to expect. It's not surprising that there were such fearful reactions to psilocybin given the likely traumatizing environment they were in, and the fact that although they had experienced LSD previously, they may have never been truly informed of what hallucinogens were or what to expect. I don't even believe that the researchers at this point knew how safe psilocybin was, so there is no way for the participants to have known that what they were experiencing weren't signs of a potentially fatal overdose. For context, based on animal studies, it would take approximately 19,000 milligrams per 70 kilogram body weight of psilocybin to have a 50-50 chance of causing a fatal overdose. To have an additional comparison, animal studies of caffeine have shown that you need 13,000 milligrams per 70 kilograms of caffeine to have the same 50-50 chance of fatally overdosing. Point being, psilocybin is incredibly safe, especially in the right environment, but without having that information, it is understandable that when you begin to experience increased heart rate, racing thoughts, which were often reported, and perceptual disturbances, that one might worry something is wrong. To get back to the description, Isbell goes on to talk about how eventually changes in mood went either in a positive direction, resulting in elation, or in a negative direction, resulting in depression. Now, some of the experiences he also described are pretty intense for what is a really rather low dose of psilocybin. It's hard to say whether or not any of this recounting has been exaggerated or simply miscommunicated, but Isbell notes that some participants had the sensation that their hands looked like animal paws, that they could see the blood and bones in their body, that they took trips to the moon and lived in gorgeous castles. Yet, importantly, he also notes that the participants did maintain their insight, that the effects were due to the drug. The drug may have altered their perception of reality, but it didn't sever their connection to reality in its entirety. They still remained somewhat oriented to the world. There were 2 participants, however, that he said began to believe the experimenters were controlling their mind. What's important to keep in mind here is that may have been a pretty rational thought to have, given the connection between the research Isbell was doing and MKUltra, which was attempting to find drugs to be used for interrogation and mind control. Getting into the quantitative data, the results showed that both LSD and psilocybin cause excitation of the nervous system, as seen by increased body temperature, heart rate, respiration rate, blood pressure, or pupillary diameter. The lowered threshold needed for the knee-jerk reflex was also shown. And this increase was much stronger for the stronger doses. Of the doses administered, they found the most comparable results were shown for the 70 micrograms per 70 kilogram dose of LSD and the 8 milligrams per 70 kilogram dose of psilocybin. One of the tables included in the article focused on pupillary diameter, which increases or becomes dilated after administration of drugs that stimulate the sympathetic nervous system, which is the system of the nervous system responsible for the fight or flight response. What this data shows is that pupil diameter increases in peaks after about 1.5 hours for those given psilocybin and about 2.5 hours for those given LSD, with the placebo condition producing little change in pupillary size over time. Although the peak change after both LSD and psilocybin are about the same, with about 1.6 millimeter increase in pupillary size, the pupils return to baseline much more quickly after psilocybin than after LSD. After 8 hours, pupil size was almost back to baseline measures for those given psilocybin, whereas there's still a 1 millimeter increase in pupillary size 8 hours later for those given LSD. Sticking with pupillary size, I also wanted to illustrate the dose-response relationship that can be seen with psilocybin. There was a clear pattern that as the dose of psilocybin increased, the effect that it had on pupillary size also increased. This dose-response relationship is really important and is a staple of drug research, particularly when determining the therapeutic range for a drug. You can essentially measure dose-response relationships for a host of symptoms, and then try to determine the dose that maximizes the positive symptoms and minimizes the negative symptoms. What's interesting to me about the findings from this study is that more recent research does at least support the results from the objective measures taken. Namely, that the peak effects after taking psilocybin are generally reached about 1.5 hours after administration, compared to 2.5 to 3 hours after LSD, and that the effects of psilocybin dissipate much quicker than those of LSD. That said, the other findings, namely the more subjective reports, are difficult to interpret or generalize. Overall, Isbell makes the claim that the experience elicited after psilocybin and LSD are similar, and to some extent that has definitely been substantiated, but there are differences other than just intensity and duration that were simply not able to be investigated in this context. Well, that concludes the first episode. I've had a lot of fun putting this together so far, and I really hope you've all enjoyed listening. I'm really excited to see where this goes. Thank you all for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.